Church Foundation embodies the continuing legacy of the faith and the gifts of generations of parishioners. We enjoy this church today because of the generosity of those who came before us. The foundation exists to ensure that the church's life and ministry will endure to benefit those in the future, just as it does for those of us who are here today. I'm Brian Womack, the president of the foundation. I'd like to recognize and thank my fellow trustees who are in the room. John Weaver, our vice president. Just raise your hand so everybody knows you are. Carly Rosati, our secretary. Our trustees, Dave Beeging, Jim Coakley, Liz Rudolph, and Donnie Wintermute. And trustees Don Hilty and Chris McMurray, who couldn't be with us today. Any of us would be happy to let you know more about the foundation, to let you know how you can join our mission of supporting the church, either today through a gift or through planned giving in the future. We've got brochures over here with our snacks. The trustees also have them. There's also more information available on the website. Today we're very pleased to have our parishioner John Burns to share with us the history of our beloved church building. John serves as the Chief Appeals Officer for Cultural Resources at the National Park Service. Prior to that, he served as Assistant Director for the Heritage Preservation Assistance Programs at the service. He holds degrees in Architecture and Architectural History from Penn State. He's a licensed architect and a longtime member of the AIA Historic Resources Committee. He's lectured and written extensively on preservation topics, including presenting a forum here 5 years ago, which I just let John know still gets a ton of hits on the website, and that's why it's still there. So if you missed that live, you can go back and watch it streaming. This is the sequel, and this will be one of those sequels where the sequel is as good as the original, I'm sure. John met his wife Debbie at work. They were married in 1977. They've been at Christ Church since 1979. John's core expertise is in the rehabilitation of historic buildings to allow their continued use without compromising their historic character and integrity. So I can think of no one more qualified to talk about this important structure to all of us. He served in leadership and offered his professional gifts to the church too many times to count, but I'll name just a few. He served on the vestry, on the property committee, on the HVAC committee, and on the committee of 500. Without further ado, let's welcome John.
Thank you, Brian. I'm not a static person, so bear with me. Next slide. Okay, Christ Church, completed 1773. It's a big brick box. It's 60 feet by 50 feet. It's 2-foot thick walls, so the interior is 46 feet by 56 feet. The floor to the ceiling is 25 feet, just to give you a sense of some of the dimensions. This is what it would have looked like at the time it was completed. This is the Columbus Street facade. No bell tower, no access to the balcony on the second floor. Originally, the floor plan over there on the left, 32 box pews, not slip pews, pews shaped like Washington's pew is still today. 2 aisles, no cross aisle across the back. A very simple altar up at the front. So, next one. And this is what it might have looked like. I photoshopped out the tower. And this is what George Washington would have seen. George Washington would have never seen the bell tower. He died in 1799, long before the bell tower was actually constructed. So someone walking up Cameron Street would have walked up and essentially seen just this. The walk would have been gravel, but other than that, it's very similar. So what would have that facade on Columbus Street looked like? Next, please. This is Pohick Church, just down the road a piece on Route 1. This is a photograph right after the Civil War, and you notice something? It's not in very good repair. Christ Church was unique during the Civil War in that it didn't suffer from the effects of the war. You notice there's windows broken out on the second floor and all. But what I wanted to really show you was the left side of that facade, which shows what our Columbus Street facade might have looked like when the building was first completed. There may have been in Christ Church a window between the 2 doors. We don't know that because it's all been covered up now, but that's a possibility. And also note that that second floor middle window, that's now the arch-type door that goes into the gallery. You wonder why that doorway is arched? There's the arch, and that's what it would have been from. Next, please. The interior of Christ Church did not have a balcony when it was first completed. This is, again, Pohick Church, a much more recent picture, obviously. They fixed everything up. Most of the woodwork here is post-Civil War. There was a lot of damage to the interior of this church and also to Falls Church during the Civil War. But this is what that two-story volume might have looked like when the property was first complete. Next, please. And then where do they get these designs from? Well, pattern books were the way most craftsmen at that time got a hold of their designs. This is a plate from Batty Langley on the left, an edition of his published in 1750. That book was in George Washington's library. And so you look at that and the Christ Church front door, and you can see there's a strong resemblance there. Next, please. Again, from Batty Langley's book, the Palladian window. If you look at that, a lot of similarities there. Now look at the top center of Batty Langley versus our top center of the window. It's a little different. So it didn't always follow things very, very slavishly. There was another master craftsman who published at that time named James Gibbs, and that perhaps was also an influence on this design. But look at the top center of the Batty Langley plate and kind of keep that image in your mind. We'll go to the next slide. And on the right there is George Washington's Mount Vernon's dining room. Look at the top center of that window. Boy, it's like a carbon copy. And then that's our Palladian window there on the left. Next, please. The altarpiece, again, an Ionic altarpiece from Batty Langley. And there on the right, this little piece over here, that is an actual drawing of the right side of our altar piece. And again, you can see there's an awful lot of similarity in the way these things were designed. Next, please. And this is the altar as it was designed and as is in place now. This is a drawing that was made just a few years ago with the help of Lori Quill, who's not here today. Oh, there she is. Thank you, Lori. Yes, yes. And we hired a young man from the Washington Alexandria Consortium of Virginia Tech who actually did the drawings for the church. Next, please. So here's the evolution of the Columbus Street facade. Upper left, you're seeing the original 1773 design. Then the first thing they did after a few years was they completed the balcony. And they had to get access to it. They decided they didn't want to have or lose pew space in the interior of the church, and so they decided to put a stair tower on the outside of the church. That stair tower had two doors, one on each side. One of them now goes into the vesting room from the outside, the other one leads upstairs. But there were originally two doors that went into a single space, what was probably two L-shaped stairs that went up to a landing and then into the gallery itself. We're not 100% sure if that was the case, but to get the length of stair run that you need, you probably would have to have L-shaped stairs in there. And there on the right, you see the belfry that came in 1818 to 1821, and then the porch was added in 1853. Interesting, the porch was added at the same time the room we're in, what we now call the mead room, was constructed. Next, please.
Do we have any sense of why they added the bell tower?
Why they added the bell tower? I think because the vestry said so.
Let there be bells.
Yeah, I think actually they had a bell before they had a bell tower. Is Julie Randall here? Okay. That's a question for the historians of the church. You know, I honestly don't know the answer to that. Okay. Here's the inside. Looking from a drone floating in the space of the church there on the left, because you couldn't be there, and then a view from that balcony. And so you can see what changes had taken place. The wine glass pulpit is in place now. The reading desk is there. The 1815 chandelier is now suspended from the center vent in the space. Other than that, it's pretty much the same, very familiar to what you see today. Next, please. Okay, now the Civil War comes. Okay, Matthew Brady came to Christ Church a number of times and photographed it a number of times. The photograph there on the left, it shows the board wall that used to surround the church on the north and west sides, that is the Cameron Street and Columbus Street facades. By the time of the Civil War, the Washington Street brick and iron gate fence was already there. And then he came in 1878 to 1880, again, photographing the church. Obviously, the church is beginning to recover. They had enough money to change that board wall to the brick and iron fence that we see today. Also, if you notice, in the corners of the church, it's visible in the right-hand photograph, two little chimneys sticking up. Stoves were added. There was no heat in 1773. So, you had to bring heated bricks from home and put them down at your feet in the pews, and that's why they had tall pews. But they did add heat. That brought a flame source into a church. It's always a danger to have flame sources in churches because for most of the time they're empty. And there's nobody there watching. So that's a risk that you have with historic churches. But anyway, the church has shown some economic recovery, the ability to build that fence. Next, please. Now, what is it? Post-Civil War, we're in construction. The church had been occupied by the Union Army with Army chaplains. The vestry was dismissed. So for 5 years, the parishioners of Christ Church didn't really control their own church. The war ends, a new vestry comes in, and they begin to say, how do we rebuild this faith community? Think about that. Think of what that rector, Reverend McKim, was facing. He had to bring together that fractured body in Christ and then begin to move forward. So one of the things they did was they changed things that were relatively simple and straightforward to do. A new beginning. They changed the interior of the church and the way it appeared. All the woodwork is now brown. It was probably what's called graining, and that is it's painted to look like fancier wood than the pine and poplar that was probably out underneath. If you go to historic houses, they'll probably tell you, oh, this is George Washington's, and these doors have been grained, and it's painted to look like natural grain of more exotic woods that are actually underlying the painted surface. The wine glass pulpit is gone, chandelier is gone, reading desk is gone, the baptismal font is shoved off in the far left corner of the chancel, and look at the chancel rail, it's way above the height of the pews. So they elevated the chancel. So these are all relatively superficial things. Things on the walls weren't really changed. The architecture in general was not changed. And then the other thing, we know that this isn't post-1870 photo. Why? Because the two memorial plaques to Washington and Lee are in the photograph. But those changes started soon after the end of the Civil War. The pulpit, the wine glass pulpit, was removed in 1867, very shortly after. So the Reverend McKim is desperately trying to bring together his community again and to form a unified congregation. Oh, and also the glass globes there, that is gas lighting. That was actually installed in 1853. So that was there prior to the Civil War. So next, please. Let me zoom in on that. And it's really terrible when you enlarge it this much. But you can see the raised pulpit, lower than the wine glass pulpit it has. You can see the rail. There are two stairs that one comes up from either side. Way off on the left, you can see the baptismal font, and you can see again the raised chancel rail. Next, please. That brings us to the plaques. Okay. These are marble plaques. You can tell that just by looking at them. Two of them, one on each side of the church. They're actually made up of 6 pieces each. And here I'm going to have to put the mic down and move. The main body, one piece. Second piece, kind of a light gray, kind of a brown gray. Third piece, fourth piece, and then 2 brackets. So actually there's 12 pieces of marble on the wall there. And how are they attached? Well, I consulted with Joe Alonzo, who is the master mason at National Cathedral, and asked him what was the technology in the 1870s for putting a plaque like this on a wall. And that's a solid brick wall. And what they would have done is they would have put anchors into the wall and attached these probably with wire to hold them in place, and then plastered the wall back to cover where that work was done. And then if we were to remove these plaques, we would simply have to reverse that process. Dig away the plaster around the plaques, and then loosen them gently and undo the wires that hold them in place, and then take them out. They'll be heavy. There's going to have to be scaffolding in there if we're going to move them, and it will take some care to be able to do that without damaging them. But he was quite confident that they could be safely removed if that's what is their ultimate fate. Next, please. And actually, back up. I wanted to say something else about this. Again, think about what that vestry, what that rector, what that congregation was going through to try and deal with all the emotional turmoil after the Civil War. There are physical wounds, there are emotional wounds, there are financial wounds. There's damage to the physical fabric of the city, to its economic base, and then to try and rebuild. And I've thought a lot about, why then, why this? When 1870 is just 5 years removed from the Civil War, and they were trying to come together as a faith community. And they said, what is it we can do? What can bring us together? Well, they made some physical changes. They painted the church, they changed the chancel. They kind of had a new beginning there. And then this is Lee's death then catalyzed feelings again. And it strikes me that they were trying to figure out a way of staying together 5 years after the end of the Civil War and moving forward. And this was a way that they did it. They could both honor Lee and then also acknowledge Washington. So I think an awful lot about what that rector, what that vestry, and what that faith community was going through in 1870. And it's, wow, we're going through a lot in today's world, but I think they went through an enormous amount of pressures and conflicts at that time as well. Please. Okay, not that long later, in the 1890s, people are beginning to think, you know what? We miss Christ Church the way it used to be. We kind of want to bring back. Now, pretend none of that color exists. This is a postcard that was colorized. Those colors are all some guy's imagination. But what's interesting, they brought in a restoration architect, a guy named Glenn Brown, and he began to restore the features that had been changed right after the Civil War. He reconstructed the wine glass pulpit. They say that they found the sounding board and brought it back and reinstalled it. They they found and restored the reading desk. They found and brought back the altar table, and they moved the baptismal font back to the center of the church. And so you still have the gas lighting. You can see it under the edge of the gallery here on the left of that slide. And they also then had gas lighting chandeliers, fixtures on either side of the chancels. They apparently didn't use candles at that time. They were using gas lights up in the altar. But again, they pretend like all of that color doesn't exist. A question?
Was this the time when they got the Ten Commandments?
I don't know. The question was, when did the Ten Commandments and the inscriptions on either side, those are original, 1773. Those, by oral tradition, have never been modified or changed over time. They've yielded quite a bit. Another question.
Well, when did the baptismal font come to the church?
Good question. And I have my crib sheet here because I can't memorize everything. Baptismal font was purchased in 1818. Okay.
Tell us a little more about the sounding board. Do you know how it was installed? I looked at it. Is it
It's a big iron rod with a big nut up in the attic that holds it. It's literally suspended. There are small brackets, if you go up and look up in the back side, there's small brackets that stabilize it against the upper reaches of the cornice at the top of the altar. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, this is another picture. This is now shortly after the restoration. Again, you have to ignore all the color because that was just an artist's imagination. But notice that the globes are missing from the gas lamps. They took it off and removed, that was kind of a Victorian era thing, to have globes in the glass lamps. Here they wanted to look more like candles, which it would have been historically. And so they removed that, and they just have the fabric mantles. Those are people who know kerosene lights and oil lights and gas lights, the little fabric mantles, and that's what you're seeing there. So the globes are gone. So we know that this picture was taken after 1894 because that's when they were removed. Next, please. I had a question?
Yes, so the bases have been, for the bases for the candelabras that we now have are pretty old. It looks like they're in these photographs.
Yes, the question is the base of the current candelabra on the chancel same as here? Sharp eye. I believe that is the case. Yeah. So anyway, here we have the Christ Church Sewing Society, a photograph that they published and sold. And again, you can see it pretty much as it was after that restoration work was done, and it continued pretty much. Also notice that the chancel rail is lowered, and also note that the pews at the front right of the church, they march all the way across to the chancel rail. There's a door there. And so, when you took communion at this time in Christ Church, the only thing you had was the front of the chancel. You didn't have the sides because they made pews there. I guess that means they needed a lot of seating capacity, which is good. But I thought that was a fascinating thing that, it must have taken a long time to do communion. But back then, they probably didn't do communion every Sunday. It probably maybe once a month. Question?
When did electricity arrive?
I'm going to get to that. The question was, when does electricity come in? I'll get to that. Next, please. And that same photo was made into a postcard. I found this, I actually bought this on eBay. If you go back a bit, one slide, please. Okay, there it is. You can see the plaques. You can just barely see the lead plaque behind the column there on the right. But the people who printed this, next, did a little artistic license that kind of subtly edited it out in here. Why they did that, I have no idea. It might have been just artistic license. Remember, these are the people who were painting things, putting colors in, stuff like that. So that was, I wouldn't read too much into that, but I found it fascinating that a picture that Christ Church sold ended up in a postcard that was sold for years and years and years. Those people know postcards. Kurt Teich is a big postcard printing company, and from that number, you know that it was printed first in 1916. The copy I bought on eBay had a postmark of 1929 on it, so they sold that for years. I don't know if the Christ Church Sewing Society got royalties over that period or not, but that might not have been a bad thing if they had trademarked, copyrighted that picture. Next slide. Okay, now I put these two views in a little later on. Okay, what's different here? Well, electricity. 1923 is when electricity was brought into the church. The picture on the left is actually half of a stereo pair. Noel asked me a question about that. Well, when did the flags come in? Well, there's actually flags you can see in the chancel in the photo on the left. I would date that 1928 based on when that company was putting together sets. And this is part of a set. You can see the little number 38 in the upper right of the left-hand picture. That meant it was number 38 in a set of stereo pairs that you could buy as souvenirs of the Washington area. Note that both Washington and Pew family pew doors are open. Interesting. And that might have been, again, the photographer saying, let's say, because they captioned that on the back of the stereo pair. But also notice up just to the left of the chancel, what's that black thing there? That's an organ console. Aha. So what's that doing there? I'll get to that. Here on the right, you can again, if you look on the far right of the chancel, you can see the base of the candelabra there, but we still have the round, not flat candelabra, so it has to be out from the wall a little bit, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. Also notice that the hymn boards are actually mounted on the pilaster on either side of the altar. You can see it there. This is apparently taken during, I think that says Advent. And so you can tell what season of the year that picture was taken. Next, please. Okay, not a whole lot changed for a long time until they introduced air conditioning in 1961 and sprinklers. So what you're seeing here, you can see 4 sprinkler heads up there in the ceiling, and you can see these lovely air conditioning supply vents introduced into the cove of the cove cornice. And they did that on 3 sides, both sides and above the altar. Now, anybody who's a scout in this room, can you tell me what's wrong with this picture? Anybody? There you go, flags on the wrong side. Why is the flag on the wrong? I have no idea, but there it is. When the American flag is displayed in a church, it is to be on the right of the rector when addressing the congregation. This is on the left. No, I thought about that too.
Well, because look at where the 10 Commandments are.
The 10 Commandments, and also, I'm the architect, I look at things differently. I'm not looking liturgically. I'm looking to see, here's the strike point for the rail gate. There was only a gate on the right side at that era. So this is the proper orientation. Now, as I look back through other photos I also found a 1958 photo with the flag on the right. So that wasn't a quickly fixed error, that was apparently there for a while. Well, sometimes you get things wrong. Okay. But I thought that was...
The gates off, so you can do communion on
But there's still a pew in front of the column. Right? When Noel and the clergy sit there, they're sitting next to that column. So that next pew out, and I'll get to that too. Okay, next please. Okay, organs at Christ Church. Okay, we're now, I think, beginning a quest to perhaps replace the current organ. The first one, and I had to write this on the slide because I'm not going to remember all this stuff, it came in 1810 or 12, and then it left here and it went to other churches. It went out to Shepherdstown, West Virginia, out to Hancock, Maryland. It eventually ended up in the Smithsonian, where it was restored. It's in the Smithsonian. It's not on display, so you can't go to the Museum of American History and see it. But Ted Guston, a previous organist here, took that picture of it in 1975. I'm grateful for that. I was not able to find any photographs of the Jardine organ or the Hook and Hastings organs that were the second and third organs that were brought in. But you can see after leaving Christ Church, they both had ongoing lives. One was moved to the parish hall, which is this space. And the Hook and Hastings organ went to Beulah Baptist Church, just down the road a piece here. Next, please. Here's the Hillgreen Lane and Company organ. This came in the early 1920s. And this is the console you can see on the left of the chancel down there. It was up next to the altar. And there was a big organ case in the balcony at the front edge of the rear part of the balcony. And so when he came up to the gallery, he came through that door and he immediately had to turn left and right to go around to the pews on either side. So the organ was where the console is today. And then there was a second set of pipes in the northeast corner of the balcony. There you can see those pipes up there. Now, we know that this picture was taken after 1923 because why? There's electricity. You can see the little, under the gallery, you can see the little chandeliers hanging there. Next, please. And then that was modified, rebuilt by the Moeller Organ Company in the 1950s. And then they obviously pushed it back, and the console then became up into the location where the console is today. That's a 1958 photograph. Next, please. And then here's the organ we have today. And that's the organ that's in place that everybody knows and listens to now. And you can see in the gallery door, you can see the arch top of that door matches the arch tops of the flanking windows that are still in place. Next, please. Back up, sorry, one more thing I wanted to say. The ceiling in Christ Church is in its original location. It is not the original plaster ceiling. In the late 1960s, that had cracked and was becoming unstable enough that they took it down and they put drywall back up. But then also you begin to get lights introduced into the ceiling of the church. Now, mind you, in 1773, that was a smooth, planar surface, unsullied by holes punctured in it. Now there's dozens, literally, I think there's over 3 dozen holes lights, sprinklers, speakers, the hatch that you can see on the upper left there in the ceiling. So it's one of my bugaboos, but that's okay. I can live with that. Next, please. Now, a lot of the information I've told you today came from what's called the Historic Structures Report that was produced by John Milner Associates in 1979 at the behest of the vestry. And this is prior to restoration work that was done in the church, and then prior to all the work that connected the buildings on this side of the campus. And one of the things that was done then was that they expanded the size of the chancel. They widened it. And so they took out the pew in front of the column on each side of the chancel, widened it. You can see here, left side, right side. You can see where it was widened. They brought got fresh boards that even matched the grain pattern and the number of rings in the wood, so it's a very, very careful match. And if you look, they took the base of the candelabra and they moved it back closer to the wall. Remember those earlier pictures, you saw a chair behind. Now that's gone. There's no room back there for a chair. And they moved it back. And what's this little diamond on the right and square on the left? That's where it had been. And so you can see the patch in the floor there. And that's where the gas chandeliers, or gas standard had been located. So there's little changes like that. Next, please. Okay, on the altar rail itself is a plaque noting where Robert E. Lee was confirmed. But remember, they changed the chancel, they widened it. And so when they did that, what they did is they took the whole chancel rail and they shifted it over about 2.5 feet, and they put a new gate on the left side. So now there's 2 gates that go into the chancel. And when they did that, what did they do? Well, all of a sudden the plaque honoring where Robert E. Lee knelt to be confirmed wasn't in the right location because they moved that piece of wood over. And so what they did is they moved it. So if you look in the upper left, there's the plaque as it exists today. There on the right, you can see the nail holes as to where it used to be. And then the bottom photograph, you can see that on the left where it is today, and the nail holes there. So it made me wonder, okay, so what's more important? Where he would have rested his arms or where he actually knelt? So I asked Noelle that, and she said, no, where he knelt. Because you're supposed to kneel erect when you're confirmed. You don't slump over and lean on the rail. So where he knelt, liturgically, is the right spot for the plaque to be. And when they moved the rail over, they got it right. They moved it back to the spot where he knelt to be confirmed. Interesting little tidbit. Next, please. Okay, and then I want to close with just a few little things. I mentioned earlier that when the gallery was installed and they built the stairs in the snare tower, there were doors on either side. There were double doors, kind of like the doors into the church. And on the vesting room side, the little color photo you see on the left, if you notice, that's a narrower door than the arch, the flat arch brickwork on top of it. That door was originally much wider. And so there were 2 doors, one on either side. When they made the vesting room in 1840, they also then knocked those 2 windows into either side of the base of the stair tower. Those came later. Those were 1840 when that became the vesting room. And then they cut through a door in the center. That's also when they introduced the cross aisle at the back of the church. And because they had to change the stair and they had to get it up enough so that they'd have headroom in that new vesting room, they actually had to reconfigure the stair, and they actually brought some of the stairs outside of the church, which is why there are several, 3 stairs, I think, 3 steps up, just to get to the door that goes up. So on the south side, which is what you see under the, that's a 1930s photo of the underside of the porch, that door was actually raised, but the original opening still exists on the left side, even though it's a narrower door. That's there now. I put that 1930s photo in. That's a Francis Benjamin Johnson photo, a well-known photographer, because at that point there was a little vestibule there, just outside. And if you go today and you look, this is the window just to the left of that door. You can see traces of caulk, and then the cornice comes all the way here and down and then down. That's where that vestibule used to be attached. You pull the shutter out, you can still see the whole thing, but it also exists above the window head there. Next, please. And here we are today. So I have, I think, assiduously left time for some questions. Okay, good, good. We've already had some questions, but I'm more than happy to answer some more questions. I stunned you into silence. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering about the large crystal chandelier that matches the smaller chandeliers that are under the big guy.
That came in 1923 with electrification. I really don't know much about its history, where it came from, or who manufactured it. I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
It's not colonial.
No, it's Belgian.
No.
It's Belgian crystal.
Okay, somebody knows more than I do. Thank you. The answer was it's Belgian crystal. Sir.
After the war, they were trying to bring the church back together. McKim wanted to expand the church. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was, rectors sometimes have, the question was, McKim, post-Civil War, wanted to expand the church, wanted to add on to it. I presume what they were going to do is move the older wall further to the east. That was met with a lot of skepticism. The Alexandria Gazette, I think that they called it something like sacrilege or heresy. I forget the exact word that they used, because they didn't see that change would take place, and it did not. So again, and then not very shortly thereafter was when the people began to think about, let's take the church back to the way it used to look. So yeah, so yes, there was a plan to expand it, and no, that didn't happen. It was discussed though. Sir?
The old building of the Falls Church and Pohick Church and Christ Church certainly have a similarity. Do you know approximately when each of them was constructed, and were they different architects? I just can't recall.
There was same architect for Pohick. Pohick came first. And off the top of my head, I think there was involvement by also Wren with Falls Church. But if you look at them physically, there's a lot of similarities. But then they also kind of follow precedents that they were getting from England at that time, of English country churches. And so it's, there's a lot of similarity among those, particularly between Christ Church and Pohick Church. So. Sir?
When was the basement added?
Basement was added with, go to the cheat sheet here, when they introduced central heating in the church. And they had to dig out a partial basement, excavate underneath the church. So when that was when also then they took away those stoves.
1853?
I think you might be right. Somebody said 1853. Yes. No, but in 1878, the stove chimneys were still there, so it couldn't have been that
Well, they
early.
may not have taken them out. Yeah, I don't know.
Right, right. Okay, I actually don't have that written down. But anyway, yes, they introduced central heating, and to accomplish that and put ducts in, they actually changed the floor height slightly inside the church. And the original pavers in the aisles were brick, 8.5 by 8.5 inch square brick tiles, paver tiles, what we today I think would call quarry tile. When the ductwork was put in for the central heating, they raised the floor and put in the slate floor that we see today. That's also when those round grates that in the aisle were introduced. And then in some pews, you can also see there's a vent that comes up through the floor in some pews. Not all of them, but some of them. And so that all took place. And then in 1910, they introduced a steam plant in the basement of this building that then fed steam to the main sanctuary, and the flame source of a furnace was then taken out of Christ Church. If you remember when I showed that Civil War era photograph with the board fence, there was a section of it kind of leaning a little bit out of kilter there. That was probably the access to the bulkhead that's still on the north side of the church that would allow them to bring coal in. And so that's probably what that was for at that time. But yes, there is a small dugout basement under the church. Sir?
I'm remembering the earthquake that we had several years ago and wondering what effect it had on the church and what the implications are of its foundation, how secure it is in light of the earthquake.
Actually, Christ Church had very little damage. There was some cracking, superficial cracking. It was mostly cosmetic, but there was no structural instabilities that were identified.
What does that mean about the footings on which the church is?
Well, it's a heavy church. We're up, 2-foot thick brick walls. It's not going to move a whole lot. It must be, I can't say this for sure because nobody's ever, to my knowledge, done the excavation to know how deep the footings are, but they're clearly below the frost line. We're up above the Potomac River, so we're not on that crummy soil you get when you build close to the river that's filled with lots of clay and all. There's probably a lot of clay in our soil here, but it was pretty stable. Remember, this used to be called the Church on the Hill when it was out of town to what was then the small little burg of Alexandria down by the river. But no, I don't see any evidence of any structural instabilities in the foundation. Sir?
Historic preservation is expensive, and
Yes, sir.
part of the mission of the foundation, the primary mission of the foundation, is to help maintain the church. What sort of grade would you give us for preserving this wonderful facility?
Well, I think that the question is, could I give a grade to the quality of care that Christ Church has exhibited over the more than 2 centuries? I would say it gets a really good grade. Everything changes a little bit. There are all sorts of changes. We've have to deal with, for instance, ADA, and we talked about maybe putting ramps up and this, that, and the other thing. And well, the solution I suggested was, you know what? Just regrade the sidewalks a little bit. There's only one step coming from Columbus into the churchyard and one step from the porch into the sanctuary. They just regraded those bricks a little bit, and so you didn't have to put a ramp up. You just modify and torque that a little bit. For this building, it's a little more difficult. That's why we got the ramp out here, because the grade change was so significant. But if you do things thoughtfully, the best preservation is stuff you don't see. It's continued maintenance. That's why the foundation is so important. Continued maintenance is the best friend of history. No question.
I can tell you an example of that. I was here the day they were repairing the porch wall. And the gentleman was out there scraping out the old mortar to put it in, to go analyze what was in that mortar, to come back, to put the right mortar in, and then, of course, we proceeded to repaint the wall. So, that's a lot of money that you don't see.
Yes. And I mentioned earlier the Historic Structures Report is done in 1979. There was mortar analysis done in many different locales to figure out what the original mortar configuration was so that you can replicate it. Because one of the things you don't want to do, colonial era brick is relatively soft, and so you don't want to put hard Portland cement modern mortar in there, because then that mortar erodes the brick. And so instead of repointing, what you end up doing is damaging your brick. And so that's, there is some Portland cement mortar in Christ Church, and it's been used. And to the extent that we can, when we have the opportunity, get it out and put in the right kind of mortar. There was also a nationally known paint expert did a paint analysis, and there were, I think the largest number of paint layers was 9, and he figured out what the pigmentation was for each of those 9 layers. So if we want to go back and paint the church authentically to a right color, we know what that color was. So we can, if you want to take it back to a specific period, paints in the early days in the colonial era were made with linseed oil, which is a slightly yellowish character. So white was always slightly yellow, not bright hospital white, I call it, like you see in today's modern paints. And so you have to be careful about little details like that. Is it expensive? Yes. Anybody that's ever restored an old car or an old boat or even their own old house knows that it's not inexpensive to maintain things. But the best thing you do is maintain it.
Time for
Sir.
one more?
One more question, okay.
Do you know the origins of where the brick and also the sandstone came from?
Good question. Sandstone, yes, it's Aquia sandstone. That's why it's all crumbly. Aquia sandstone was loved by carvers because it was easy to carve. It's hated by preservationists because what makes it easy to carve makes it easy to erode in today's acid environment. And so that's why the White House got the same problem, Christ Church has the same problem. Mount Vernon, yeah, anywhere there's Aquia stone, you're going to have issues. Not unlike the relatively soft brownstone in New York townhouses. Same issue, soft material, easy to carve, hard to maintain over time. So, okay, one last thing, since this is the Foundation Sunday. I've got my check. Please bring yours. Thanks.
John, thank you so much. He's still not lying. I was going to say support your church by supporting your foundation, but John beat me to it. Thank you, John, for that very helpful and interesting lecture. It was as good as the original for those of you who saw the original, but if you missed the first one, it's on the website. This one will be on the website too. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Let's thank him one more time.
Thank you.
Awesome.